where the forest does not echo your voice. It absorbs it, keeps it, learns it. In the winter of 1916, a girl named Lillian Crowe vanished into those woods. 3 days later, she came back, but something else came with her, and everyone in Coldwater Ridge would eventually understand the truth too late. Sometimes the mountains give back what they take, just not in the same shape. Coldwater Ridge was the kind of place maps barely bothered with, not because it didn't exist, but because it felt like a place the world had already begun to forget. A thin scattering of weather-beaten cabins clung to the mountainside like stubborn memories. Smoke curled lazily from stone chimneys in the early mornings. Fence posts leaned at awkward angles, half swallowed by drifting snow. Narrow footpaths wound through the trees, carved not by design, but by decades of repeated footsteps. There were no train lines, no telegraph wires, no doctor closer than 2 days' ride. Winter ruled everything here. It dictated when you worked, when you slept, when you spoke, and when you stayed silent. People did not survive Coldwater Ridge through optimism. They survived through routine, through caution, through habit. 14-year-old Lillian Crowe had grown up with those habits etched into her bones. She knew which paths stayed passable after snowfall, which creek crossings froze solid first, which bends in the trail collected drifts deep enough to swallow a child whole. Her parents often said she knew the mountains better than most adults. She moved through the woods with quiet confidence, like someone who had learned their language long before learning her own. That's what made her disappearance feel impossible. January 11th, 1916, began like any other winter day. The sky hung low and pale, clouds pressing against the mountaintops like a heavy lid. The schoolhouse, a single-room structure with frost creeping along the inside of its windows, dismissed the children early when the teacher saw the storm rolling in. It was the responsible thing to do, the familiar thing to do. Lillian gathered her books, tied her scarf tighter around her neck, and stepped out into the cold alongside the other children. Boots crunched over thin snow. Breath clouded the air. There were no goodbyes, only nods and quiet departures as each child took their separate trail home. Lillian turned toward the familiar path that led through the trees, hugging her books to her chest. The wind picked up almost immediately, pushing against her back like an unseen hand, urging her onward. She was used to weather like this. Everyone was. The mountains tested you. You endured. But the storm arrived faster than anyone expected. By late afternoon, snow fell thick and sideways, erasing landmarks within minutes. The sky darkened too quickly. Shadows blurred. Familiar paths vanished beneath fresh drifts. Lillian never reached home. At first, her absence went unnoticed. In winter, delays were common. A broken strap, a longer route taken to avoid deep snow, a brief stop at a neighbor's cabin to warm hands by the fire. But when dusk settled and her boots still hadn't crossed the threshold, her mother began to feel that quiet tightening in her chest. By nightfall, lanterns flickered across Coldwater Ridge. Neighbors gathered without needing to be asked. That was the way of mountain communities. When one family's fear rose, everyone felt it. Men wrapped scarves high over their faces and stepped into the storm. Women called Lillian's name from cabin porches until their voices grew hoarse. Older boys followed familiar trails, boots sinking deeper with every step. They searched until their lungs burned with cold, until their fingers numbed around lantern handles, until the snow swallowed every sound except the wind. They found nothing. No abandoned scarf, no torn fabric, no broken twig to suggest a fall, no sign of struggle, only footprints. A single trail of small boot prints, half filled by drifting snow, leading steadily toward the frozen creek that cut through the lower valley. The men followed them in silence. Step after careful step, lanterns swaying, breath coming slow, the tracks ended at the creek's edge, not scattered, not broken, not disrupted. They simply stopped. Beyond the final print, the snow remained untouched, smooth, undisturbed, as though no one had crossed it in days. The men stood there long after the wind began to howl harder, long after the lanterns started to flicker low. No one spoke. No one needed to. They had all seen enough winters to know what tracks should look like when something had gone wrong. There should have been sliding marks, signs of panic, uneven steps, something. But there was nothing, just absence. In the days that followed, explanations began to form. They always do. Some said she'd fallen through a weak patch of ice. Some said wolves. Some said a sudden gust of wind had knocked her off balance, sent her tumbling somewhere they hadn't searched yet. Reasonable theories, comforting theories. But no body surfaced. No torn clothing appeared along the creek banks. No signs of blood or disturbance showed in the snow. And beneath the spoken possibilities, deeper ones lingered unvoiced. Old thoughts, uncomfortable ones, the kind of stories that belonged to earlier generations, to grandparents and great-grandparents who had spoken of things living deeper in the woods, things that watched, things that listened, things that followed children too far from lantern light. No one spoke those ideas aloud, not out of disbelief, but out of instinct. By the third day, the searches slowed, not because hope had died, but because exhaustion had set in. Snow kept falling, trails disappeared as quickly as they were retraced. People began to understand what the mountains were telling them, the same lesson they had taught generation after generation. Sometimes, when the wilderness takes someone, it does not leave enough behind to find. And beneath that understanding lived an older, quieter rule, one that no one admitted to believing, yet everyone obeyed. If the woods keep someone long enough, they usually do not give them back. The knock came just before midnight, soft, polite, measured. 3 slow taps against the rough wood of the Crowe cabin door. It was not the kind of knock made by someone in distress. Not frantic, not urgent, not desperate. It was controlled. Inside the small cabin, the fire had burned down to dull orange embers. The wind whispered against the chinks between logs. The mountain held its breath. Margaret Crowe woke instantly. Mothers in isolated places learn to wake quickly. They learn the difference between the normal creaks of old timber and the sounds that do not belong. Her eyes opened before her mind understood why. Heart already racing in her chest. Another knock, 3 taps again. Same rhythm, same patience. She pushed herself upright, blankets sliding from her shoulders. For a moment, she could only listen. The cabin felt too quiet, as though even the fire had gone still, to hear the sound. Daniel was already moving beside her. He did not speak. He didn't need to. Years of marriage in a place like Coldwater Ridge taught people to read each other without words. He reached for the lantern by the bedside, hands moving automatically, striking a match with a careful precision. The flame caught. Light bloomed across the room. Another knock echoed through the cabin. Margaret's breath caught. Something about it felt wrong. Not because of fear, but because of the calmness of it. No one knocked like that at midnight in the middle of winter. Daniel pulled on his boots, shrugging into his coat without hesitation. He lifted the lantern and crossed the small room, every step slow and deliberate, not from fear, from caution. Margaret followed him to the edge of the room, hands pressed tight against her chest. He reached the door, paused. The silence on the other side felt heavier than the silence within. Then he opened it. The cold entered first. A sharp, biting gust swept through the doorway, carrying the smell of snow and pine and deep winter air. The lantern flame flickered violently, throwing long shadows across the walls. Then Daniel lifted the lantern higher and saw her. Lillian stood just beyond the threshold, barefoot in the snow. Her small feet rested directly against the frozen ground, toes pale but unblemished. No blood, no raw skin, no sign of frostbite, no trembling. She wore no coat, no shawl, no gloves. Her dark hair lay smooth against her shoulders, as though she had just brushed it before bed. Her face was clean, her cheeks lightly flushed, her lips calm and color warm, not blue with cold. Her breathing was slow, steady. She looked untouched. For a heartbeat, Daniel could not move. The lantern light framed her perfectly, illuminating every familiar feature, the curve of her jaw, the faint scar near her eyebrow from when she'd fallen as a child, the slight asymmetry of her front teeth when she smiled. It was her, every part of her. Margaret's knees gave out before her mind could catch up. She crumpled to the floor, a sound halfway between a sob and a prayer escaping her lips as she whispered her daughter's name again and again, as though speaking it enough times might anchor this moment in reality. Lillian, Lillian, Lillian. Daniel stepped forward automatically, closing the distance between them. He set the lantern on the small table by the door and reached for his daughter. His hands trembled violently as he wrapped his coat around her shoulders. She did not resist. She did not react. She allowed him to guide her inside, allowed him to pull the door shut behind them, allowed the warmth of the cabin to close around her. Margaret rose from the floor and crossed the room in 3 unsteady steps, pulling Lillian into her arms with a force that bordered on desperation. She buried her face into her daughter's hair, weeping openly, her entire body shaking. Lillian stood there, still, not stiff, not frightened, not confused, just calm. Margaret pulled back just enough to cup her daughter's face in her hands, searching desperately for signs of harm. "Where have you been?" she whispered. "Oh, my sweet girl, where have you been?" Lillian's eyes focused slowly, as though adjusting to the light. "I came home," she said quietly. Her voice was the same, soft, familiar. Margaret laughed and cried at the same time, pressing another kiss to her daughter's forehead. Daniel turned away briefly, dragging a hand across his face to hide the way his eyes burned. Relief flooded the room so suddenly it felt almost dizzying. A miracle. That was the only word Margaret could find for it. A miracle. No other explanation mattered. Not the tracks, not the storm, not the impossible timing. Her child was here, alive. That was all that mattered. Daniel lifted Lillian gently and carried her toward the small table near the hearth. He set her down carefully on a chair, crouching in front of her. "You must be freezing," he said softly, already reaching for a blanket. He wrapped it around her shoulders, tucked it securely. His hands brushed her wrists, her fingers, her ankles. Warm, not chilled, not numb, not stiff. Warm. He hesitated. "Lillian?" he asked gently. "Are you hurt anywhere?" She looked at him. Just looked. "No," she said after a pause. Daniel swallowed. He stood slowly, backing away just enough to study her properly, now that the lantern light held steady. The longer he looked, the more he realized something that unsettled him in a way he could not yet name. She had not shivered once, not when the door opened, not when the cold air rushed inside, not when she stood barefoot in the snow, not when the warmth returned. No trembling, no reaction, no adjustment. Margaret did not notice. She was too busy brushing Lillian's hair away from her face, too busy murmuring thanks under her breath, too busy holding her daughter's hands as though she might vanish again if she let go. Daniel, however, kept watching, and somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the relief and disbelief and gratitude, a thin, unfamiliar feeling began to take shape. Not fear, not yet, just unease, a quiet, wordless thought that did not yet have form. She should have been colder. At first, everyone celebrated. Coldwater Ridge had seen enough loss over the years to recognize a miracle when one appeared. People walked the narrow trails to the Crowe cabin with offerings in their hands and gratitude in their voices. Fresh-baked bread, jars of preserved apples, extra firewood stacked neatly by the door. They embraced Margaret with tears in their eyes. They clasped Daniel's shoulders with rough hands and quiet nods. They called Lillian's return a blessing. The pastor arrived before noon on the second day. He stood inside the small cabin with his hat held respectfully to his chest and offered a prayer of thanks so heartfelt that even the most skeptical among them felt something warm settle briefly in their bones. Lillian sat quietly at the table while it happened. She did not smile. She did not fidget. She did not seem embarrassed by the attention. She simply watched. The neighbors told themselves she was in shock. That was the explanation everyone preferred. Trauma. That was a word people were beginning to understand, even in places like this. Of course she was quiet. Of course she seemed distant. A child lost in a storm for days would not return unchanged. They told themselves this was normal, but relief has a way of fading quickly when discomfort begins to take its place. The first thing Margaret noticed was the laughter, or rather, the absence of it. Lillian had always been a soft-spoken child, but she had laughed easily at small jokes, at her father's stories, at the way the barn cat chased its own tail across the floorboards. Now, the laughter was gone, not replaced with sadness, not replaced with anger, just gone. When neighbors spoke to her, she answered politely, always politely, but only when they spoke first. She did not initiate conversation, did not ask questions, did not offer details about where she had been or what had happened. Her responses came slowly, too slowly. Someone would ask, "Do you remember me, Lillian?" She would look at them for a long moment, not confused, not frightened, just still. Then she would answer, "Yes." The delay unsettled people more than if she had said nothing at all. Margaret began to notice other things, names, for instance. Children Lillian had grown up beside, children she had shared lessons with, chores with, seasons with, now felt unfamiliar to her. When Mrs. Holloway brought her son by the cabin, beaming with relief to see his old friend alive, Lillian stared at him for a full heartbeat too long. "What's your name?" she finally asked. The boy's smile faltered. Margaret laughed awkwardly, quickly covering the moment with excuses. Her memories just tangled up a bit, she said. That storm must have rattled her something fierce. Everyone nodded. Everyone agreed. Still, the boy did not come back again. Inside the cabin, the changes became harder to explain away. Lillian began studying ordinary objects with uncomfortable intensity. A spoon held in her hand turned slowly between her fingers as she examined its shape. The way the firelight reflected off the metal, the way it felt when she tapped it lightly against the table. A door latch lifted and lowered repeatedly, as if she were testing how much pressure it required, how it moved, how it sounded. A quilt, her mother's stitching traced carefully, pattern by pattern, square by square, for long stretches of silence. It did not look like curiosity. It looked like learning. Margaret told herself this was simply the mind of a child recovering, that perhaps Lillian was grounding herself in the familiar, reacquainting herself with the world. But the thought brought her no comfort. The worst change revealed itself slowly over the course of several restless nights. It began with a feeling. That sense mothers know well, the awareness of being watched, even while asleep, the instinctive pull toward their child's presence. Margaret woke one night and knew immediately that something was wrong, not from sound, not from movement, but from absence. She turned her head toward Lillian's bed. It was empty. Panic surged up her chest before she could stop it. She sat upright, heart hammering, scanning the small cabin wildly. Then she saw her. Lillian stood at the window, perfectly still. The pale moonlight outlined her small frame. Her head tilted slightly toward the tree line beyond the glass. Her hands hung loose at her sides. Her bare feet rested flat against the cold floorboards. Margaret whispered her name. Lillian. No response. She called again, louder this time. Lillian, sweetheart. Slowly the girl turned her head. Her eyes found her mother's face with calm, unreadable focus. I'm here, she said quietly. Margaret rose from bed and crossed the room quickly, gathering her daughter into her arms. Lillian's body was warm, her heartbeat steady, her breathing normal. Why aren't you sleeping? Margaret asked softly, brushing her hair away from her face. I wasn't tired, Lillian replied. The answer was simple, reasonable, but it did not ease the tension in Margaret's chest. The next night, it happened again, and the night after that. Always the same. Lillian standing at the window, Lillian staring toward the forest, Lillian listening. By the fifth night, Daniel noticed too. He did not say anything at first. He simply began waking more frequently, eyes opening to check the room without fully understanding why. Each time, he found the same scene. Their daughter, upright, silent, watching the dark. On the seventh night, he finally asked, What are you looking for out there? He said gently, keeping his voice low so as not to startle her. Lillian did not turn around. I'm not looking, she replied. Daniel frowned slightly. Then what are you doing? There was a pause, a long one, long enough that he almost thought she would not answer. Then she said, softly, evenly, listening. Daniel did not ask what she was listening for. He already sensed that whatever the answer might be, he would not like it. Outside the window, the forest stood motionless. Snow clung to branches. Shadows layered themselves between tree trunks. The night held its breath, as though it too were waiting for something to happen. Inside the cabin, the girl continued to stand, unblinking, unmoving, listening. And slowly, with each passing night, the unease that had once been easy to ignore began to settle into the walls of the Crowe home, not as fear, not yet, but as something colder, something quieter, something that felt unmistakably like the beginning of a realization no one was ready to face. It was Mrs. Holloway who noticed the tracks first. She had lived beside the Crowe family for nearly 20 years, long enough to recognize the rhythms of the mountain, long enough to know what belonged in the snow and what did not. That morning, the sky was a pale, exhausted gray. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving the world hushed beneath a fresh, untouched blanket of powder. The kind of snow that made every sound feel intrusive, the kind that recorded every movement without mercy. Mrs. Holloway stepped out onto her porch with an empty bucket in her hand. She made it exactly 3 steps before she stopped. Across the narrow clearing surrounding the Crowe cabin were footprints, bare footprints. At first glance, she assumed they must belong to Lillian. That was the natural thought, the comfortable thought. Children did strange things. Children wandered. Children sleepwalked. But comfort evaporated the moment she looked closer. The prints were too long, not just longer than a girl's foot should be, longer than any foot in that valley. They were narrow, unnaturally narrow. The arch pressed too deeply into the snow, as if the foot had bent in a way it was never meant to. The heel marks were pronounced, dug in sharply, like something that carried its weight backward. She knelt slowly, setting the bucket aside, studying them in silence. They did not lead away from the cabin. They did not arrive from the forest. They circled back and forth, side to side, overlapping again and again, like pacing, like something confined, like something testing the edges of an invisible boundary. Mrs. Holloway stood, brushed the snow from her knees, and stared at the Crowe cabin for a long time before she finally turned back toward her own home. She did not fetch water that morning. Instead, she waited. By midday, the tracks had become the unspoken center of the settlement. People did not talk openly about them. They simply drifted closer under harmless excuses. A dropped errand, a casual walk, a need for conversation. They gathered quietly around the Crowe cabin. They saw the prints. No one laughed. No one made jokes. Men crouched low to inspect the depth of the impressions. Women stood back with their hands folded tightly in their shawls. Children were ushered away before they could look too closely. Someone suggested a trick of melting and refreezing. Someone suggested an animal walking oddly. Someone suggested that grief made people see things. But no one could explain why the tracks never led anywhere. Margaret heard the murmurs before she heard the words. She stepped out onto her porch, confusion flickering across her face as she looked at the small gathering beyond her yard. "What's happened?" she asked. No one answered immediately. Mrs. Holloway stepped forward at last, her expression carefully neutral. "Margaret, I don't want you to take this the wrong way." Margaret's eyes dropped to the snow. Her breath left her body all at once. She saw them. The footprints were unmistakable now that she knew where to look. They circled the cabin, passed beneath the windows, crossed the threshold of the porch, turned back on themselves, over and over. Her stomach tightened. "She didn't leave her bed," Margaret said immediately, the words tumbling out too quickly. "Lillian didn't. I'd know. I would have heard her." No one accused. No one argued. But the silence that followed felt heavier than any disagreement. That night, Margaret did not sleep. She lay awake, listening to every shift of wood in the cabin, every whisper of wind through the cracks, every soft movement from Lillian's side of the room. Near dawn, exhaustion finally claimed her. When she woke, the first thing she did was look at the floor beside Lillian's bed. The blankets were undisturbed. The girl lay on her side, breathing evenly, her face peaceful. Relief washed through Margaret's chest. Then she remembered the snow. She pulled on her boots without waking her husband and opened the cabin door slowly, bracing herself against what she might see. The air outside was sharp with cold, and there they were, new tracks, fresh, bare, circling again. Margaret stepped down from the porch and followed them with her eyes, tracing the pattern they formed. They moved along the cabin walls, paused beneath the windows, turned abruptly, repeated the same path over and over until the snow was churned thin. It looked deliberate, intentional, not wandering, not confused, not random, like something studying the structure from the outside, like something learning. She turned back toward the door and froze for just a moment, just a heartbeat. She thought she saw movement at the edge of the trees, a tall shape, too still to be wind, too narrow to be human. Then it was gone. By the third morning, the settlement stopped, pretending they weren't seeing it. The tracks returned every day, always bare, always wrong, always circling. No trail ever approached the cabin from the forest. No line of prints ever led away. They simply appeared, as though they began there, as though whatever made them had never come from outside at all. Daniel began checking the door latch each night, twice, 3 times. He placed small objects against the door frame, a broom handle, a loose piece of kindling, anything that might shift if the door opened while they slept. Every morning, the door remained closed, the objects untouched, the tracks waiting. Margaret began watching Lillian more closely. The girl never mentioned the footprints, never asked about the whispers spreading through the settlement, never seemed concerned when neighbors began keeping their distance. She simply continued standing at the window each night, listening. One evening, as Margaret tucked the blankets around her, she asked carefully, "Have you been outside while we're sleeping?" Lillian's eyes lifted to meet hers. "No," she said. Her voice was steady, her expression calm. Margaret searched her face for any sign of deceit. There was none. "What about dreams?" she asked quietly. "Do you dream about being outside?" Lillian considered the question for a long moment. Then she said, "I don't dream anymore." Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft at first, gentle, patient. By morning, it would erase the tracks. By the following dawn, they would return. And slowly, with each new appearance, the settlement of Coldwater Ridge began to accept a truth they did not yet have the courage to name. Whatever had come back to the Crowe cabin was not entirely their daughter anymore. Pastor Elijah Boone had buried enough mountain folk to know grief's shapes. He had seen the hollowed eyes of men who returned from logging accidents, too late to save a friend. He had sat through funerals where the widow clutched a child to her chest as if sheer force of will could pull the departed back. He had blessed enough newborns to recognize the purity of innocence, the fragile hope that shimmered like a candle in a drafty cabin. Yet, standing near Lillian, he felt a tension in his chest that defied logic. It was a feeling he had never encountered in all his decades of tending to souls, neither sorrow nor joy, but something like unease that gnawed quietly at the edges of his mind. He watched her as she sat on the rough-hewn bench outside the old chapel, the late afternoon sun slanting through the trees and casting fractured shadows across her small, pale face. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and yet, even in their stillness, they trembled faintly. She was quiet, almost impossibly so, as if every sound she made had been measured and restrained by some unseen force. Elijah cleared his throat and took a seat beside her, careful not to startle her. "Lillian," he began gently, his voice carrying the soft cadence of the mountains. "Do you remember the creek?" She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though she were peering back through time itself. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember falling?" he asked next, bracing himself for the inevitable. "No," she replied. The word hung between them, neither denying nor confirming the events that had so traumatized the town. He paused, studying her face, searching for any flicker of recognition, any hint that she understood what had happened, or perhaps what was still happening. "Do you remember where you were?" The silence that followed was thick, almost tangible. Elijah could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant crow of a rooster, the soft creak of the chapel door as it swung with the breeze. He wanted to speak, to offer comfort, but something restrained him. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, deliberate. "I wasn't lost." The word struck him like a stone dropped into still water. He stared at her, unsure whether to feel relief or dread. There was a certainty in her tone that was unsettling. Most children, after an ordeal like hers, spoke in fragmented memories, repeating events with fear or confusion. But Lillian spoke as though she had chosen her path, as though the creek, the forest, the shadows themselves were known companions, not enemies. Elijah's mind raced. He had been the shepherd of this valley for decades. He had preached about sin and salvation, about the visible and the unseen, but nothing in all his sermons, nothing in the dusty pages of his Bible prepared him for this. He had encountered grief, despair, and even evil. But here, in the presence of this child, there was something beyond comprehension, a knowledge perhaps that belonged not to the world of the living. He decided to press gently, careful not to frighten her. "Lillian," he said, "sometimes people get lost in the woods. Sometimes things happen that are hard to understand. But if you weren't lost, then where were you?" She blinked slowly, her gaze fixed on some point beyond him, beyond the trees, as if she were seeing not the chapel or the forest, but a place that existed only in memory or imagination. "Somewhere else," she said simply, almost too easily. Elijah swallowed, feeling the weight of his own ignorance pressing down on him. Somewhere else. What did that mean? Another part of the forest? Another time? Or somewhere he could not even name, a place where ordinary logic did not apply? He remembered the stories the older mountain folk whispered in the evenings by the fire, tales of spirits that walked the ridges, of children who wandered into hidden hollows and returned changed, eyes wide with things they could not say. He had dismissed these stories for years as folklore, comforting explanations for unexplainable events. But now, listening to Lillian, he wondered if the stories had been warnings, not tales. Elijah leaned closer, lowering his voice to a near murmur. "Did anyone touch you?" he asked, though he feared the answer. Lillian shook her head. "No, I wasn't alone." Her eyes met his briefly, and he saw something that chilled him to the bone. It was not fear, nor joy, nor sadness. It was recognition, as though she knew him and yet did not, as if some memory long buried had awakened in her mind. The pastor rubbed his hands together, trying to shake off the creeping dread. "Lillian, do you remember the forest?" Her lips curved into the faintest smile, enigmatic and unsettling. "Yes, but it wasn't the forest, I think you know." Elijah leaned back on the bench, staring at the rough wooden boards beneath him. He had always believed he understood the mountains, the woods, the people who called them home. But suddenly, everything seemed unfamiliar, alien. He realized with a cold certainty that the girl before him had touched something he could not comprehend, something older than the trees themselves, older than the chapel, older than the stories passed down through generations. He stood slowly, the shadows stretching long across the forest floor. Lillian watched him, silent and still. For the first time in decades, Pastor Boone doubted everything he thought he knew about the world, about safety, about the thin line between what was real and what was not. And in the quiet, under the fading light, the child whispered again, almost to herself, "I wasn't lost." The words lingered, echoing through the chapel, through the trees, through the mountains themselves. And Pastor Elijah Boone knew that some mysteries did not require answers. They only demanded that one bear witness. Weeks had passed since the disappearance, and the frozen creek that had swallowed the days of winter was beginning to surrender to spring. The ice, once thick enough to hold the weight of a horse, now cracked and groaned underfoot like a dying whisper. The mountains were still silent, but there was a new tension in the air, a sense that the forest had noticed the returning warmth and stirred quietly, as if watching. Daniel returned alone. He had insisted on it, despite the tremor in his hands and the pleading eyes of neighbors. "I have to know," he muttered, voice rough with sleepless nights, "even if it kills me." They had tried to warn him, telling him the ice was treacherous, that what had been lost in winter might be gone forever. But Daniel Boone did not heed warnings. He did not leave questions unanswered. The creek lay ahead, black water shimmering under the weak sunlight. The ice clung to its edges, jagged and fragile, and Daniel could see the indentations where Lillian's small boots had pressed into snow months before. The path of her disappearance traced a crooked line along the frozen bank, ending abruptly where the water had swallowed the last footprints. His chest tightened as he knelt, hands brushing against the brittle ice. He tested the surface near the edge, a cautious poke with a sturdy branch. The ice cracked in a sharp, hollow note, sending shivers up his spine. He swallowed hard and leaned closer. His breath rose in white clouds, curling into the stillness. Somewhere beneath the thin ice, the creek held secrets, cold and unyielding, that refused to answer. Daniel took a deep breath and pressed further, breaking through the brittle layer near the point where the tracks had vanished. The icy waters swirled around his fingers like black smoke, cold enough to bite through gloves and frost-bitten skin. He braced himself, and then something caught. It was not the warm weight of his daughter. It was something smaller, something unnatural. A boot surfaced, floating unnervingly upright as if held by invisible hands. Daniel's stomach lurched. He knelt fully now, pulling it free with trembling hands. It was Lillian's winter shoe. The soft leather was scuffed, the laces frayed, but unmistakably hers. But what made his blood run cold was what clung to it. A small footbone still strapped into the shoe, pale and rigid, detached from the body that should have carried it. Daniel gasped and stumbled backward, the icy bank crunching beneath his boots. His hands shook violently, leaving traces of black water streaking across the snow. He wanted to scream, wanted to curse the world, but the sound caught in his throat, swallowed by the forest. Around him, the trees were still, their skeletal branches reaching skyward like the fingers of the dead. He looked down at the creek, and for a moment, the water seemed to pulse, dark and alive, as if breathing. His mind screamed for logic, for reason, but the world had already abandoned them. What he had pulled from the black depths was no accident. It was deliberate. It was meant to be found. The wind rose, carrying with it the faintest echo of laughter, the softest brushing of fabric across frozen water. Daniel froze, muscles locked, as the sound drifted through the trees. It was not Lillian's voice, and yet it carried the cadence of a child. Not playful, not innocent, something older, something aware. He knelt again, examining the shoe. The strap, fastened tightly around the tiny foot, was stained in dark patterns that refused to define themselves. He dared not look further, fearing that the creek might offer more than he could bear. The water had already claimed enough. The thought of what lay beneath, what had severed a child from herself and left only this symbol, made his stomach twist. Daniel's hands tightened around the shoe, knuckles white. He realized with a bone-deep horror that this was not simply a tragedy of nature. Something in the forest, something in the creek, had waited for them to return. It had left a message, and the message was clear. They were not safe. Lillian had not wandered into the woods by accident. She had not been lost. The cold seeped through his clothes as he rose to his feet, boots sliding on wet ice. The creek stretched ahead, dark and unbroken, whispering of things that should not exist. He wanted to leave, to run back to the warmth of the cabin and shut the doors against the world. But he could not. He could not abandon what had happened here, what had begun with a simple walk along a frozen creek. He turned toward the mountains, toward the cabin where the remaining townsfolk whispered prayers he did not share. His mind raced, filled with questions that had no answers. Lillian's eyes, her voice, her certainty that she was not lost. They haunted him, demanding explanation. But all that remained tangible was the shoe, the foot, the black water. As he walked back along the treacherous ice, Daniel knew one truth above all. The creek had claimed more than a child. It had claimed certainty, peace, and the fragile illusion that the mountains were safe. And somewhere beneath the water, in the twisting roots and the dark depths, the thing that had taken Lillian waited still, watching, patient, knowing. The sound of dripping water followed him back to the frozen edge, and for the first time, Daniel Boone understood the unthinkable. Some things in the mountains were not meant to be understood. Some things were meant to endure, silent and cold, until they decided to speak again. He shivered and tightened his coat around him, glancing once more at the creek its black water swallowing the last light of day. Lillian was out there, and the creek, the forest, the unseen watcher beneath the ice had not finished with her. The truth settled over the Boone household like frost in the early morning, silent, inevitable, and impossible to ignore. It coated every corner, seeped into the beams of the old cabin, and lay heavy on the walls, pressing against the ceilings as though the house itself mourned. Daniel had wanted to believe that the nightmare had ended when Lillian returned, that the creek had finally released her, and that the mountains could once again offer a fragile peace. But he could not escape the feeling that something had followed her home, something that had watched, learned, and waited for the perfect moment. The girl who had come back had never truly crossed from the creek. Not fully, not in the way that mattered. Something else had stepped into her place, something patient and cunning. Daniel tried to remember the warmth of her small hand in his, the softness of her hair against his cheek, the innocence in her eyes. But each memory now carried a subtle wrongness, a hesitation, a twitch, a shadow that did not belong. Whatever had stood at his door that night, the thing that had smiled and called her name, had done more than merely imitate. It had studied. It had learned her shape somewhere else, beyond the frozen creek, beyond the whispering forest. It had observed the way she tilted her head when curious, the way her shoulders slumped when afraid, the rhythm of her breathing when she slept. It had listened to her words, repeated them quietly in the woods, echoing the cadence, the soft murmurs, the laughter that had once seemed innocent. Daniel's nights became a symphony of small horrors. Every creak in the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside the cabin sent him bolting upright. He listened for her voice, but it came too perfectly, too carefully, as though rehearsed. Every word she spoke was measured, every laugh placed just so. It was familiar, and yet foreign. Something was missing beneath the surface of her mimicry, something the human heart could feel but could not name. He watched her posture, the way she carried herself from room to room. The girl in the cabin moved like his Lillian, but there were subtle deviations. A tilt too long on her head, a glance held a fraction too long, a stiffness where fluidity should have been. His stomach churned as he realized that the thing outside the creek had not only taken her shape, it had practiced it, over and over, perfecting a version of his daughter that could fool everyone but him. Even her habits had been copied. The way she traced patterns in the dust on the windowsill, the way she lined her shoes neatly by the door, the way she hummed a lullaby when the cabin grew quiet. All of it was there, yet the life behind the actions was absent. Daniel longed to hear the real Lillian's voice, to feel the true warmth of her presence. But the sound that came back from the girl in his cabin was hollow, like wind moving through empty branches. And worse, it listened. The thing had been patient, watching the world from the shadows of the woods. It had learned what frightened him, what comforted him, what kept him awake at night. And now it was inside his home, sitting across from him at the supper table, laughing at jokes it should not have known, answering questions with a precision that made the hair on his arms rise. Daniel tried to speak with the local elders, the ones who had whispered tales of the forest for generations. They told him stories of the mimicry of the woods, of children who vanished only to return subtly changed, their forms perfect, their voices true, but their souls borrowed, stolen by something older than time. He had always dismissed such tales as superstition, as folklore meant to warn wandering children and reckless fathers. Now he could not. Each morning he watched her wake with a meticulous care, brushing her hair, tying her boots, arranging her simple dresses in neat folds. Every motion mirrored the child he had once known. Yet, when she smiled at him, he saw the wrongness there, a glimmer of something alien behind the eyes that had once been bright and trusting. It was subtle, hard to define, but it was undeniable. The forest seemed to pulse beyond the cabin, alive with intent. Shadows moved where none should have been. The wind carried whispers that could not be names, could not be words, only the impression that someone or something was always listening, always learning, always preparing. Daniel felt his heart tighten with every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the trees. He realized that the thing in the creek was not content with one small act of terror. It had begun a slow, deliberate study, shaping itself to fit the life it had stolen. He could see it in her eyes now, in fleeting glances that lasted too long, in questions she asked that revealed knowledge she could not have gained from anywhere but observation. The thing had become her, but only in form, not in essence, not in the spark that had made his daughter human. It was a copy, perfect in imitation, hollow in truth. And Daniel knew with a dreadful clarity that someday the imitation would falter. Someday the thing would act on what it had learned. And then he would see the full measure of what the woods had taken from him. Until then, he could only watch, only wait, only endure the presence of something that wore the face of his child, but carried a darkness that was not hers. The girl, or what had become of her, sat silently at the table that evening, tracing her fingers along the rim of her cup. She looked up at him, and he felt the piercing certainty of her gaze, not the warmth of recognition, but the precision of observation. Every habit, every movement, every nuance of the girl he loved had been copied. And behind the imitation, something waited, patient, intelligent, calculating. The truth was simple, and it would not leave him. The girl who came home had never truly returned. Whatever haunted the creek, whatever had claimed the mountain's frozen heart, had learned everything it needed. And now it had become her. It had practiced. It had listened. And it would not stop. They never told the town what had happened. Not the neighbors, not the church, not even the sheriff. Words could not contain the shape of what they had lived through, the impossible, the uncanny, the sense that the world itself had shifted in those mountains. They packed quietly that spring, gathering their few belongings into wagons and trunks, and left Coldwater Ridge behind without fanfare or farewell. The cabin remained empty and silent, the forest slowly reclaiming its edges. Daniel glanced back once, feeling the weight of the creek, the black water that had taken more than a child, and the shadows that had followed her home. He could still hear the faint echo of footsteps that weren't hers, laughter that carried just the wrong note, and the faintest whisper of a voice that spoke with perfect mimicry. The old-timers, however, could not forget. Even decades later, the story lingered in whispers around firelight and rocking chairs, passed from one generation to the next. Coldwater Ridge remembered the lesson the mountains had carved into their lives, the one truth they could not ignore. When the woods take someone, it is not enough to pray, to hope, to wait. Sometimes the mountains return someone. Sometimes the mountains do not return the person at all. They return something else, a shadow in the shape of a child, moving just like the one they lost, a voice that imitates laughter but carries no warmth, a presence that watches, waits, and learns from the living, perfect in appearance, hollow in essence. And the forest keeps its secrets, patient and silent. It teaches its lessons slowly through fear and absence, leaving behind the knowledge that some things are not meant to be understood, only survived. Daniel and Lillian, or what had become of her, vanished into memory and rumor. The creek froze again with the next winter. The trees whispered with unseen voices, and Coldwater Ridge endured, forever wary of what might answer when someone disappears, because the mountains do not forgive, and the mountains never forget.